I hired a plumber to fix a simple leak, while my son and his wife were sipping cocktails on a beach in Oahu. An hour later, the plumber called me, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "Warren, there is a little boy hiding behind the water heater, and the door was deadbolted from the outside." When I drove over and uncovered their darkest secret, my heart nearly stopped. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to uncover a painful, devastating truth about someone you thought you loved. My name is Warren. I am 63 years old, and I spent 4 decades breathing in sawdust and fiberglass, wearing out my knees and my backs as a general contractor, so that my only son, Justin, could have the soft, easy life I never had. I wanted him to be successful. I wanted him to be a man of character. I paid for his expensive university degree, and 5 years ago I drained a significant portion of my retirement savings to co-sign the mortgage on a sprawling, pristine suburban home for him and his new wife, Megan. At the time, Justin hugged me and told me I was his hero. He promised that house would always be my home too. But promises fade quickly when the ink dries. Over the last 5 years, they have treated me less like a father and more like an unpaid, invisible property manager. They love to flaunt their flawless, self-made aesthetic on social media. Megan spends her days posting pictures of their immaculate white kitchen, their imported cars, and their child, free-by-choice lifestyle. But behind the camera, the reality was incredibly hollow. I was the one they called when the gutters needed cleaning in the freezing rain. I was the one expected to fix the drywall when they dented it. I never complained because a father always wants to feel useful to his child. But the lack of respect was a slow, quiet poison. Last week, Justin and Megan packed their designer luggage for a 14-day luxury vacation in Oahu. They did not invite me. They did not even bother to call and say goodbye. Instead, I woke up on a Tuesday morning to find a passive-aggressive list of chores taped to the steering wheel of my truck. The note, written in Megan's looping handwriting, did not say hello or thank you. It was a list of demands. Check the mail water her imported orchids and fix a slow leak she had noticed in the basement utility room. I stared at that piece of paper, feeling a deep, familiar exhaustion settling into my bones. For a moment, I considered driving over there with my heavy toolbox, getting on my hands and knees on the cold concrete, and fixing the pipe just like they expected me to. But my back had been acting up, and honestly, my pride had finally had enough of being treated like the hired help. I refused to spend my Tuesday crawling around in the damp basement of a house I helped pay for, doing chores for a son who could not even bring himself to pick up the phone. So I reached into my pocket and called Sam. Sam is a trusted veteran plumber, a good, honest man I have worked alongside for decades on countless construction sites. I gave Sam the garage code to Justin's house, told him to locate the utility room in the basement, fix the leak, and send the invoice directly to my email. I figured that would be the end of it. I poured myself a cup of hot coffee, sat down on my porch, and breathed in the crisp morning air, completely unaware that my life was about to be torn apart. Exactly 1 hour and 12 minutes later, my phone rang. I saw Sam's name on the caller ID and answered, fully expecting him to complain about a rusted valve or ask where the main water shut-off was located. But Sam was not calling about pipes. When he spoke, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. His voice was trembling. It was a ragged, breathless sound I had never heard from this tough, seasoned worker in all the 30 years I had known him. "Warren," he whispered, his words stumbling over each other in a panic. "Warren, you need to get over here right now." I asked him what was wrong, thinking a pipe had burst and flooded the newly finished basement. "It is not a pipe, Warren," he said, and I could hear the sheer terror vibrating through the receiver. The utility room door. It was locked from the outside. I had to pry off a heavy-duty exterior deadbolt just to get in. I frowned, my mind struggling to process the words. Why would Justin put a deadbolt on the outside of a windowless utility room? Before I could even ask the question, Sam's voice broke completely, turning into a choked sob. "Warren, there is a child down here. A terrified, emaciated little boy. He is wedged between the water heater and the concrete foundation, and he is too scared to come out." The coffee cup slipped from my fingers. It shattered against the wooden floorboards of my porch, hot liquid splashing against my boots. But I did not feel a thing. The world seemed to stop spinning. The air was sucked entirely out of my lungs. A little boy locked from the outside. In my son's house, Justin and Megan were strictly loudly against having children. They despised the idea of kids ruining their pristine, curated lives. What Sam was saying was impossible. It had to be a mistake. But the raw terror in my friend's voice was undeniably real. I did not ask any more questions. I did not waste another second. I grabbed my car keys, abandoned the broken mug on the porch, and ran to my truck. I backed out of my driveway so fast, the tires screamed against the asphalt. The drive to Justin's upscale neighborhood usually takes 20 minutes. I made it in 10. I ran every red light, my heart hammering a frantic, agonizing rhythm against my ribs. A sickening dread pooled in my stomach, twisting my insides into tight knots. I tried to rationalize it during the drive. Maybe it was a neighbor's kid playing a prank. Maybe someone broke in, but the detail about the heavy-duty deadbolt locked from the outside crushed every logical excuse. My late wife used to say that Justin had a good heart but a weak spine. She worried about him, about the kind of man he would become when we were no longer around to guide him. I always defended him. I always made excuses for his selfishness. But as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white, I prayed to her. I prayed that this was all just a horrible misunderstanding. I prayed that my son was not a monster. As a contractor, I know houses. I know the dark, hidden spaces behind the drywall. But I never imagined I would have to uncover a darkness like this inside a home where my own blood lived. I slammed on the brakes, leaving my truck parked at an awkward angle in their perfect manicured driveway. I sprinted toward the front door, my hands shaking as I punched in the keypad code, completely unaware that what I was about to find down in that basement would shatter my family forever. I threw my truck into park so hard, the transmission groaned. Sam was standing at the edge of the driveway. He is a man who has seen busted pipes, flooded basements, and collapsed roofs, but he looked completely broken. His face was the color of dirty ash. He had a heavy steel wrench gripped in his right hand like a weapon. He did not say a word to me. He just turned and pointed toward the open garage door. I walked past the luxury cars my son, Sol, and his wife leased. The pristine garage floor smelled faintly of expensive car wax and entitlement. We stepped into the mudroom and walked through the flawless open-concept kitchen. The marble countertops gleamed under the recessed lighting. Everything upstairs was an absolute picture of modern suburban perfection. But the silence in that house felt heavy and wrong. Sam led the way down the carpeted stairs to the finished basement. I remembered every inch of this space. I helped frame the walls 5 years ago. I spent weekends measuring, cutting, and hanging drywall so Justin could have a massive entertainment room. But Sam did not stop in the media area. He walked straight toward the back corner. He stopped in front of the utility room. It was a windowless concrete box that housed the furnace, the electrical panel, and the massive water heater. It was never meant to be a living space. It was barely meant for storage. I stared at the solid wood door. My breath caught in my throat. There was a heavy-duty commercial-grade deadbolt installed right above the standard handle, but it was installed backward. The keyhole faced the hallway. It was not designed to keep people out of the utility room. It was designed to keep someone locked inside. The brass plate around the lock was scratched, meaning it was used frequently. Sam looked at me with tears pooling in his eyes. He reached out and turned the handle. The deadbolt had already been forced open by Sam. The wood around the frame splintered and cracked from where he used his wrench. He pushed the door open. The smell hit me before anything else. It was a suffocating, putrid wave of unwashed laundry, stale sweat, and human waste, desperately masked by an overwhelming chemical pine scent from 4 different automatic air fresheners plugged into the power strip. My eyes burned from the artificial scent. I reached up and pulled the string for the single overhead light bulb. The harsh yellow light flooded the small concrete room. My eyes scanned the cramped space. What I saw made my blood turn to absolute ice. In the far left corner sat a plastic bucket lined with a black garbage bag. Next to it was a portable camping toilet. But the true horror, the detail that made my stomach heave violently, was sitting directly across from the door. It was a high-end automated pet feeder, the kind you buy to feed a large dog while you are at work. The digital display was glowing green. Inside the clear plastic hopper, I did not see dog food. It was filled to the brim with dry generic cereal mixed with broken pieces of protein bars. A thick plastic water dispenser, the kind used for livestock, was bolted to the concrete wall next to it. This was not a panicked, last-minute decision. This was an engineered environment. Justin and Megan did not simply abandon a child to go on vacation. They calculated his caloric needs. They programmed a machine to dispense handfuls of dry food every 12 hours so they could sit on a beach in Oahu and drink cocktails without a single worry. They automated his survival. They built a cage inside the house I helped them buy. I forced myself to look toward the back of the room behind the massive metal cylinder of the water heater. The space was incredibly narrow, squeezed between the hot metal tank and the cold concrete foundation. A pile of old, dirty moving blankets was shoved into the gap. For a second, I thought the room was empty. Then the pile of blankets shifted. A small, fragile hand reached out and gripped the edge of the frayed fabric. The hand was so thin I could count the bones beneath the pale skin. Slowly, a little boy pulled himself back into the shadows. He looked no older than 6. He was wearing an oversized stained gray t-shirt that hung off his frail shoulders like a rag. His bare feet were covered in dirt and soot. He pressed his back flat against the concrete wall, trying to make himself as small as possible. He was trying to disappear. I dropped to my knees on the hard floor. The sudden movement made him flinch violently. He threw his arms over his head in a defensive posture, expecting to be hit. The sight of that pure, instinctual terror broke something deep inside my soul. A grown man, my own son, had taught this child that sudden movements meant pain. I held my hands out, keeping my palms open and empty so he could see I meant no harm. I tried to speak, but my voice failed me. I swallowed the lump of absolute rage forming in my throat. I told him he was safe. I promised him nobody was going to hurt him anymore. I spoke in the softest, gentlest tone I could manage, the same voice I used to comfort Justin when he was a toddler afraid of the dark. The hypocrisy of that memory made me want to scream. The boy did not answer. He did not make a single sound. He slowly lowered his arms and peeked over his knees. His face was smeared with dirt and dried tears, but his eyes were what I will never be able to forget. They were wide, hollow, and completely vacant. They were the eyes of a creature that had been locked in the dark for so long it forgot what the sun looked like. There was no hope in his stare, only a silent, desperate expectation of cruelty. He looked from me to the open door, then back to the automatic feeder ticking quietly in the corner. He was starving, but he was too terrified to move toward the food while we were in the room. He had been trained like an animal. I slowly reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a granola bar I always kept there for long days on the job site. I unwrapped it carefully, making sure every movement was slow and predictable. I placed it on the concrete floor, pushing it gently toward the gap behind the water heater. The boy stared at this granola bar. His tiny chest was heaving with quick, shallow breaths. He looked at me again, his hollow eyes searching my face for the trick, waiting for the punishment. When I did not move, he darted his hand out, snatched the food, and retreated instantly into the shadows. He ate it with a frantic, animalistic speed that made tears spill hot and fast down my own cheeks. Sam stood in the doorway, his large hands wiping his face with a dirty rag. We did not need to exchange words. The reality of the room spoke for itself. My son and his wife had carefully curated a life of absolute luxury upstairs, while hiding a starving prisoner in the basement. They bought imported orchids and designer luggage with a clean conscience. They smiled for photos on the beach, while a machine dispensed dry cereal to a child locked in the dark. I remained on the floor until the boy finished eating. I did not rush him. I let him realize that the door was open, that the lock was broken, and that the nightmare in this room was finally over. The rage brewing inside my chest was no longer a hot, explosive anger. It had settled into something cold, sharp, and focused. I was not just going to take this boy out of the house. I was going to systematically destroy the people who put him here. I kept my hands open, waiting for him to trust me, just enough to step out from behind the water tank. I knew that the moment I carried him up those stairs, the life my son had built would be completely and permanently dismantled. I did not pull out my phone and dial for the police. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to bring a fleet of squad cars to that driveway. But 40 years in construction taught me to measure twice and cut once. If I called the authorities right, then Justin and his wife would receive a phone call in Hawaii. They would immediately hire an expensive defense attorney. They would fabricate a story about a massive misunderstanding, a temporary timeout gone wrong, or a sudden emergency. They would use their wealth and their polished reputation to muddy the waters and drag the truth through years of legal red tape. I could not give them a single second to prepare a defense. I needed to dismantle their lives completely, and to do that, I needed to gather all the ammunition myself. I took off my heavy flannel work jacket. The fabric was worn and smelled like sawdust and old coffee. I knelt slowly on the concrete floor and draped the large coat over the trembling little boy. He flinched at first, bracing for a blow, but when the heavy warmth of the jacket settled over his frail shoulders, he pulled the fabric tight against his chest. I kept my voice barely above a whisper. I told him we were leaving. I asked him if he had a name. He stared at the floor for a long time before his lips barely moved. He whispered the name Leo. It was the first sound I had heard him make. It was a fragile, broken sound, but it was enough. I promised Leo that nobody would ever lock that door again. I stood up and looked at Sam. The plumber was still standing in the doorway, staring at the automated feeder ticking in the corner. His hands were clenched into tight fists. I walked over to him and put a hand on his shoulder. I told Sam to finish the plumbing job exactly as he had been hired to do. I told him to pack up his tools, bill me directly, and lock the front door behind him. Most importantly, I looked my old friend dead in the eyes and swore him to absolute secrecy. I told him to speak to no one, not his wife, not his crew, and certainly not the police. Sam did not ask a single question. He simply nodded, his jaw set in a hard line. He understood that this was no longer just a rescue. This was a war. I gathered Leo into my arms. He weighed almost nothing. I carried him up the carpeted stairs, through the immaculate kitchen, and out to my truck. I placed him in the passenger seat and buckled him in. During the entire drive to my home, Leo did not speak. He kept his eyes locked on the passenger window, watching the suburban mansions fade into the dense pine trees of the town limits. My home is a quiet, modest cabin I built with my own hands after my wife passed away. It is miles away from the manicured lawns and the sterile perfection of my son's neighborhood. It is safe. When we arrived, I brought Leo inside. The cabin was warm, smelling of wood smoke and old books. I led him to the bathroom and started the warm water in the tub. I did not force him. I simply left a clean towel and some oversized sweatpants on the counter, showed him how the warm water worked, and stepped outside the door to give him privacy. I listened to the quiet splashing of water, feeling a knot of pure grief twisting in my stomach. A 6-year-old boy should not know how to be this silent. He should be loud and chaotic and full of life. Instead, he moved like a shadow, trained to remain entirely invisible. While he bathed, I went to the kitchen. I pulled out a carton of eggs, some butter, and a loaf of bread. I cooked a simple hot meal, scrambled eggs and thick slices of buttered toast. The smell of real warm food filled the small cabin. When Leo emerged from the bathroom, swallowed up by my gray sweatpants and a long-sleeved shirt, I guided him to the wooden table. I set the plate down in front of him. I poured him a tall glass of cold milk. I sat across the table and watched him eat. It was not a normal meal. It was a desperate, heartbreaking display of survival. Leo ate with a ferocity that made my chest physically ache. He shoved the eggs into his mouth using both hands, completely ignoring the fork. He chewed as if he expected someone to snatch the plate away at any given second. He drank the milk in huge, frantic gulps. I sat there in total silence, fighting back the tears that burned the edges of my eyes. I softly told him to slow down, promising him there was plenty more food, assuring him the kitchen would never close. He did not slow down until every crumb was wiped clean from the ceramic plate. After the meal, exhaustion finally overtook his sheer terror. The warm bath and the full stomach broke through his defensive shell. I led him to the spare bedroom. It was a quiet room facing the woods, filled with thick quilts and a soft mattress. Leo crawled into the center of the bed and pulled the heavy blankets all the way up to his chin. He fell asleep almost instantly. I stood in the doorway for a long time, listening to the steady, deep rhythm of his breathing. I needed to make sure he was truly resting before I allowed the anger to fully take over my mind. I walked back out to the living room and sat heavily in my worn leather recliner. The silence of the cabin was usually a comfort, but now it felt suffocating. The questions began to hammer against my skull like a relentless physical force. Who was this ghost child? Justin and his wife had built an entire public identity around being completely unburdened. They loudly proclaimed themselves child-free by choice to their friends, to our family, and to the thousands of strangers who followed their luxury lifestyle brand online. They boasted about their freedom, their disposable income, and their ability to travel to Hawaii on a whim. Yet they had a starved, terrified boy locked behind a commercial deadbolt in their basement. The contradiction made absolutely no sense. If they hated the idea of raising children, why was Leo there? He was not a secret they could simply ignore. He was a human being that required a highly calculated system of automated feeding and concealment. They had gone through extraordinary lengths to keep him hidden from the world, and more importantly, hidden from me. I was the one who came over to fix their drywall and clean their gutters. They knew I had a spare key. They knew I could walk into that house at any moment. That was why the utility room was locked from the outside. That was why they used a plumber to handle a basement leak while they were out of the country, assuming a stranger would never question a locked door. I realized I could not just sit in my chair and wait for them to return from their tropical vacation. I needed answers, and those answers were locked inside the immaculate walls of their suburban fortress. If I wanted to destroy them completely, I needed the paper trail. I needed to know exactly who Leo was and why they were torturing him. I picked up my phone and called my nearest neighbor, a retired school teacher named Evelyn, who lived a quarter-mile down the dirt road. Evelyn is a tough, kind woman who raised 4 kids on her own. I told her I had a family emergency and needed her to sit in my cabin and watch over a sleeping child. I did not give her the horrific details over the phone, but she heard the absolute grim determination in my voice and agreed to walk over immediately. When Evelyn arrived, I handed her the spare key to my cabin. I told her Leo was deeply traumatized, that he should not be woken up, and that if he did wake up, she just needed to offer him a warm smile and let him watch cartoons. Evelyn took one look at my face and nodded, promising she would not leave that house under any circumstances. I stepped back out into the cold afternoon air and got into my truck. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my old joints ached. I put the vehicle in drive and headed back toward the manicured lawns and the polished driveways of my son's neighborhood. I was not going back to fix a plumbing leak. I was going back to tear their darkest secrets right out of the walls. I pulled my truck back into the driveway of my son's house. The late afternoon sun was reflecting off the spotless windows. Walking through the front door for the second time that day felt entirely different. The silence of the pristine living room was no longer just empty. It was malicious. I walked through the foyer. The air smelled of expensive vanilla diffusers. It was a sterile, perfect smell designed to mask the rotting soul of the people who lived there. I ignored the plush white sofas and the expensive abstract art hanging on the walls. I marched straight down the hallway toward Justin's home office. The door was shut tight. I turned the knob, but it was locked. Justin always kept his workspace secure. He used to tell me he needed absolute privacy for his important corporate conference calls. He acted like his home office was a sanctuary of hard work. But 40 years of construction work teaches you a few things about residential hardware. I knew exactly what kind of cheap interior door they had installed. I did not need to kick it down. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a stiff plastic loyalty card from my wallet, and slid it straight into the gap between the door and the frame. With a quick upward flick of my wrist, the latch clicked and the door swung wide open. The office looked like a photograph from a luxury lifestyle magazine. There was a sleek glass desk in the center of the room. A leather ergonomic chair sat behind it. Floating shelves covered the walls, displaying carefully arranged books that looked like they had never been opened. It was a room designed for showing off on video calls, not for actual honest labor. But I was not there to admire the interior design. I walked straight to the heavy steel filing cabinet tucked away in the small closet. It had a physical key lock built into the top drawer. I did not bother searching the desk for the key. I went back to the kitchen, grabbed a heavy flathead screwdriver from the utility drawer, and returned to the office. I wedged the steel tip deep under the metal lip of the top drawer and pulled down with all my weight. The cheap locking mechanism snapped with a loud metallic crack. I pulled the drawer open. The front half of the cabinet was filled with exactly what I expected to find. There were thick stacks of glossy brochures for exotic resorts. There were luxury car lease agreements printed on heavy paper. There were thick envelopes containing premium credit card statements. I pulled out a few of the bank statements and flipped through them. The numbers were staggering. They were spending thousands of dollars a month on expensive dining high-end clothing boutiques and spontaneous weekend getaways. There were charges for $500 dinners and $2,000 spa treatments. Their entire life was a carefully funded illusion. They were spending money they clearly did not have from their regular jobs. But I knew there had to be something else. I shoved the pristine financial records aside and reached all the way to the very back of the deep metal drawer. My fingers brushed against a thick, unmarked manila folder. It was shoved tightly against the cold metal back wall, hidden away from any casual glance. I pulled the folder out and dropped it onto the glass desk. My hands were remarkably steady as I flipped it open. The first page was an official document bearing the blue seal of the State Department of Child and Family Services. My breath caught in my throat. I read the names printed at the top of the form. Justin and Megan were legally registered as specialized emergency foster parents. And right there, printed in cold black ink under the placement section, was Leo's full name. My hands finally began to shake as I read the intake dates. They had taken official custody of that little boy almost a year ago. A whole year. They had spent 12 months smiling at my dinner table, posting pictures of their carefree lives, bragging about their disposable income, all while a child was locked in a concrete box just a few feet beneath their imported hardwood floors. I turned to the second page of the file, and the true horrifying motive stared back at me. It was a detailed medical evaluation form signed by a doctor I did not recognize. The profile had been completely falsified. It claimed that Leo suffered from severe nonverbal autism, alongside violent and unpredictable behavioral issues. The fraudulent report stated that the boy was a profound danger to himself and required around-the-clock specialized containment and intensive supervision. The words on the page described a violent, uncontrollable child, which was a complete fabrication. The little boy sitting in my cabin was terrified, fragile, and utterly passive. He was not a danger to anyone. But the lies on this paper served a very specific wicked purpose. I read the financial compensation section at the bottom of the page. Because of this fabricated extreme medical diagnosis, Justin and Megan qualified for the absolute maximum state medical stipend available to foster caregivers. The state was depositing over $4,500 into their bank account every single month. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. It knocked the wind completely out of me. They were not fostering a child out of the goodness of their hearts. They were hoarding a human being. They had turned a vulnerable, voiceless little boy into a silent, automated paycheck. They were using his suffering to subsidize their sports cars, their designer wardrobes, and their endless tropical vacations in places like Oahu. They locked him behind a heavy deadbolt and fed him through a timed machine so they could collect the state money without ever having to actually look at him, touch him, or care for him. He was nothing but a revenue stream to them. They kept him buried in the dark so his existence would not ruin the pristine, child-free social media image they worked so desperately to project to the world. They loudly told everyone they did not want the burden of raising kids while quietly cashing checks meant for a child's medical care. I stood in the middle of that perfectly decorated office clutching those government papers, feeling a kind of cold, calculating rage I had never experienced in my entire life. The love I had for my son simply evaporated. It vanished into thin air, replaced by an absolute need for justice. My son was not just selfish or misguided. He was a monster who had monetized the suffering of a child. I took out my phone and carefully photographed every single page in that manila folder. I made sure the state seals the signatures and the exact dollar amounts were perfectly clear in the pictures. I needed undeniable proof. I could not just walk into a police station and tell them my son was a monster. Justin was charming. He was charismatic. He knew how to talk his way out of trouble. If I confronted him without an ironclad paper trail, he would invent a lie. He would claim the basement room was a temporary safety measure. He would use his wealth and his polished reputation to paint me as a confused, overreacting old man. I could not give him that chance. I had to build a case so solid that no expensive lawyer could ever tear it down. I placed the foster care documents exactly as I had found them. I slid the manila folder back into the dark corner of the filing cabinet, hidden behind the luxury car leases and the credit card bills. I pushed the metal drawer closed. It would not lock again because of the broken mechanism, but I arranged the files so it looked undisturbed. I wiped my fingerprints off the glass desk and the door handle. I walked out of the home office and pulled the door shut behind me. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the perfect kitchen. This house was a crime scene disguised as a suburban dream. I walked out the front door, locked it, and got back into my truck. The drive back to my cabin felt entirely different. I was no longer a panicked father rushing to fix a problem. I was a man preparing for war. They thought they were untouchable, but they had severely underestimated the man who built the very foundation they were standing on. I knelt on the plush carpet of my son's pristine home office, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I had already found the state foster care forms hidden at the back of the metal drawer. I had already uncovered the sickening truth about the little boy locked in the concrete utility room. A normal man might have stopped there. A normal man might have been too overwhelmed by the sheer horror of a child being kept like a caged animal to keep digging. But 40 years of working in construction had hardwired a specific instinct into my brain. When you find one massive crack in a foundation, you do not just patch it and walk away. You inspect every single inch of the concrete because where there is one catastrophic failure, the rot usually spreads much deeper. I wiped the cold sweat from my forehead and reached back into the broken filing cabinet. I moved past the glossy travel brochures and the leasing agreements for their imported sports cars. I pulled out a thick, heavy accordion folder labeled with the address of the house. This was the property file. 5 years ago, I sat in a brightly lit bank manager's office with Justin and Megan. They were newlyweds eager to start their perfect life, but they lacked the necessary credit history for a house this grand. I wanted my son to have the best. I wanted him to build a solid future. So I took a pen and co-signed a massive 30-year mortgage linking my pristine credit and my hard-earned retirement savings to this sprawling suburban fortress. I remembered the way Justin hugged me that day, tears of gratitude in his eyes, promising he would never let me down. That memory tasted like ash in my mouth as I opened the folder. I sifted through the original closing documents, the property tax receipts, and the homeowner's insurance policies. Everything seemed standard until I reached the very bottom of the stack. Tucked beneath the original property deed was a fresh, crisp envelope from a major national bank. The date printed on the postage was from exactly 3 months ago. I slid my thumb under the flap and pulled out a thick stack of loan origination documents. The bold letters across the top of the first page read, "Home Equity Line of Credit Agreement." I stared at the numbers printed on the summary page, my vision blurring for a fraction of a second. The bank had approved a line of credit for $150,000 against the equity of the house. I knew exactly how a home equity line of credit worked. I had used one decades ago to float my contracting business during a bad recession. It allows a homeowner to borrow massive sums of cash against the paid-off value of their property. But there was a massive, glaring problem with these documents. Because I was a legal co-signer on the original mortgage, any secondary loans or liens placed against the property strictly required my explicit notarized authorization. The bank would never legally release $150,000 in equity without my signature. My hands were completely numb as I flipped to the final pages of the loan agreement. I bypassed the dense legal jargon and went straight to the signature lines. There at the bottom of the page, staring back at me in black ink, was my own name. Warren. My signature was written on the dotted line. But I had never seen this document before in my life. I leaned in closer, holding the paper up to the light of the desk lamp. To a bank clerk processing thousands of digital files a day, the signature probably looked entirely legitimate. But to me, the man who had written that name millions of times on blueprints, checks, and building permits, the forgery, was glaringly obvious. Justin had always possessed a handwriting style similar to mine, a byproduct of helping me fill out invoices when he was a teenager. But he lacked my fluidity. I could see the slight hesitations in the loops, the unnatural pressure applied to the tail end of the letters, where he had paused to make sure he was mimicking my slant perfectly. He had practiced this. He had sat at this very glass desk, tracing my name over and over again until he felt confident enough to submit it to a federal financial institution. The realization was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. My son had not just made a terrible moral mistake by locking a child in a basement. He had committed multiple severe felonies. By forging my signature to extract $150,000 from a federally insured bank, Justin was guilty of first-degree wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. He had stolen the equity I had worked my entire life to build, gambling, my financial security, to fund his empty, superficial lifestyle. I flipped through the attached bank statements showing the disbursement of the funds. The entire $150,000 had been drained almost immediately. I traced the outgoing wire transfers printed on the subsequent pages. Tens of thousands of dollars had been routed directly to various high-interest credit card companies. They had maxed out multiple platinum cards, buying designer clothes, booking first-class flights, and eating at exclusive restaurants to maintain their wealthy influencer image online. The home equity loan was a desperate, fraudulent bailout to keep their house of cards from collapsing. But loans of that magnitude require substantial monthly payments. I looked at the repayment schedule. The minimum monthly installment for the borrowed equity was nearly $3,000. I closed my eyes as the final sickening piece of the puzzle clicked perfectly into place. I suddenly understood exactly why they had falsified Leo's medical profile to secure the absolute maximum state foster care stipend. The state was paying them over $4,500 a month to care for a supposedly violent, severely disabled child. Justin and Megan were using that government money to cover the monthly payments on the fraudulent home equity loan. They were literally using a starving, traumatized little boy to pay the interest on their stolen wealth. Leo's suffering was subsidizing their luxury lifestyle. He was locked in a dark, concrete box fed by a machine like livestock, solely because his existence generated the exact amount of cash they needed to avoid defaulting on a massive illegal debt. A profound, icy calm washed over me. The initial shock and the heartbreak were entirely gone. There was no longer a single trace of paternal love left in my body for the man who lived in this house. He was a complete stranger to me now, a ruthless, calculating predator who deserved absolutely no mercy. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and opened the camera application. I turned on the flash and stood directly over the glass desk. I took my time. I carefully photographed every single page of the home equity loan agreement. I made absolutely sure the lighting was perfect, eliminating any glare on the glossy paper. I captured crystal clear images of the bank routing numbers, the exact dates of the wire transfers, and the masterfully forged signature bearing my name. I took dozens of photos, ensuring that even if one image was blurry, I would have a flawless backup. This was the financial nail in their coffin. When the police finally arrived, Justin would not just be facing child endangerment charges. He would be facing federal prosecutors who do not negotiate when it comes to bank fraud. Once I was certain I had digitized every piece of evidence, I began the meticulous process of covering my tracks. I stacked the loan documents perfectly, placing them back into the crisp bank envelope. I tucked the envelope exactly where I had found it, buried deep beneath the original property deed and the insurance policies. I slid the heavy accordion folder back into the dark recess of the metal drawer, arranging the glossy travel brochures and car leases around it, so the contents looked entirely undisturbed. I gently pushed the top drawer of the filing cabinet closed. Because I had broken the internal locking mechanism with my screwdriver, it would not secure properly, but I aligned the metal faceplate so it appeared completely normal. Unless Justin tried to actively lock or unlock the drawer with his key, he would never notice it had been forced open. I wiped down the glass desk, the cabinet handles, and the doorknob with my jacket sleeve to remove any lingering fingerprints. I stood in the center of the immaculate home office and took one last look around, committing the silence of the room to memory. I turned off the lamp, pulled the door shut behind me, and walked out of the house, ready to initiate the total destruction of my son's life. The sun was barely rising over the pine trees when I woke up the next morning. I had not slept for more than a few minutes. I sat in the armchair in my living room and listened to the quiet breathing coming from the spare bedroom. The heavy envelope of forged loan documents was safely locked inside the glove box of my truck. I had the financial evidence of their massive fraud. But I knew that financial crimes could be tied up in courts for years. Expensive defense attorneys could spin bank records into administrative errors. I needed something that no lawyer could ever talk their way out of. I needed absolute proof of the physical torment they had inflicted on that innocent boy. I walked into the spare room. Leo was awake. He was sitting completely still in the center of the bed. He was staring blankly at the wall. He did not make a single sound. He was waiting for instructions, just like a captive animal. I felt my chest tighten with a familiar sorrow. I gently told him we were going to go for a short ride. I wrapped him in a soft blanket and carried him out to my truck. I did not drive to the local hospital. A hospital would trigger an immediate mandatory report to the state system. The state system would automatically notify the registered foster parents. Justin and his wife would receive an emergency phone call in Hawaii. They would immediately panic and hire their legal team before I could build my trap. I needed an examination completely off the books. I drove to the other side of the county. I pulled up to a small brick building that housed the private practice of Dr. John Carter. John is an old friend of mine. We served in the military together decades ago before he went to medical school. He had officially retired 2 years ago, but he still kept his clinic open for a few hours a week to help local families who lacked proper health insurance. I had called him on my way over. I explained that I was bringing in a child who needed absolute discretion. When I carried Leo through the back door of the quiet clinic, John was waiting for us. He took one look at the frail boy in my arms, and the welcoming smile vanished entirely from his face. John guided us into a warm examination room. He did not wear a sterile white coat to avoid frightening the child. He spoke in a very soft and gentle voice. He moved slowly to show Leo he was not a threat. The thorough examination took well over an hour. I stood quietly in the corner of the room and watched as my old friend carefully documented every single horrifying detail. The dark truth of what my son had done was laid completely bare under the bright lights of that medical office. The final results were absolutely enraging. John turned to me with a look of pure disgust. He confirmed what I had already suspected in my gut. Leo did not have severe nonverbal autism. The medical profile Justin had submitted to the state was a complete and malicious fabrication designed solely to maximize their monthly foster checks. The boy was simply paralyzed by profound psychological trauma. He was severely malnourished. His small ribs were clearly visible against his pale, bruised skin. He suffered from extreme vitamin deficiencies caused by living in total darkness without sunlight. His muscles were heavily atrophied from prolonged confinement in that tiny concrete box behind the water heater. But the darkest revelation came when John ran a rapid toxicology screen using a small blood sample. He pulled me out into the hallway and closed the door so Leo could not hear us. John told me the boy's blood was thick with traces of over-the-counter sedatives. My stomach churned violently. The dry cereal and protein bars inside the automatic pet feeder were not just a lazy way to feed a prisoner. Justin and his wife had been deliberately crushing up sleeping pills and mixing them into the dry food. They were drugging a 6-year-old boy to keep him lethargic and silent. They laced his only source of survival with chemicals so they would never have to hear him cry while they entertained their wealthy friends upstairs. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The sheer evil of their systematic abuse was beyond anything I could have ever imagined a human being could commit. John was visibly shaking with anger. He walked back into his private office and sat down at his computer. He did not just take casual medical notes. He drafted a comprehensive sworn medical affidavit. He meticulously documented every single bruise on Leo's frail body. He detailed the severe malnutrition, the dangerous muscle atrophy, and the exact chemical traces of the sedatives found in his bloodstream. He signed the bottom of the document and stamped it with his official medical seal. He handed me the thick file. I now possessed the undeniable physical evidence of their monstrous neglect. Combined with the photographs of the forged loan documents, I held the absolute destruction of my son's life right in my hands. I thanked John for his help and promised him that absolute justice was coming very soon. I carried Leo back to my truck and placed the medical affidavit safely in the glove box next to the stolen bank records. We did not go straight back to the cabin. I drove to a large department store on the edge of town. I left Leo safely secured in the vehicle with the doors locked and the air conditioning running. I ran inside and quickly filled a shopping cart. I bought soft cotton shirts, warm sweatpants, and a pair of sturdy sneakers that would actually fit his tiny feet. I walked down the toy aisle and picked out a large plush bear and a set of wooden building blocks. I went to the grocery section and bought fresh strawberries, roasted chicken, and real milk. When I returned to the truck, I handed Leo the plush bear. He looked at the soft toy as if he did not understand what it was. He touched the fabric with his fingertips, completely mesmerized by the simple kindness. We drove back to my quiet cabin in the woods. My neighbor Evelyn was waiting on the porch. She helped me carry the shopping bags inside. I drew another warm bath for Leo and helped him change into the brand new clean clothes. He looked down at his new sneakers. They were a bright blue color. He traced the laces with his thin fingers in pure wonder. I went into the kitchen and prepared a massive plate of warm chicken and fresh fruit. I placed it on the wooden table. Leo climbed up into the chair. He did not eat frantically this time. He looked at the vibrant red strawberries and the steaming food. He carefully picked up a piece of fruit and took a small bite. The sweet juice covered his lips. He looked up at me. He stopped chewing for a moment. The vacant, hollow stare that had broken my heart the day before was gone. He looked at the warm food, he looked at his new blue shoes, and he looked at the plush bear sitting on the chair right next to him. And then very slowly, the corners of his mouth turned upward. Leo smiled. It was a tiny, fragile smile. It was hesitant and unsure, but it was completely real. That small expression of pure joy was the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing I had ever seen in my 63 years of life. The sight of that innocent smile completely shattered the last remaining pieces of my old life. Any lingering doubt I had about what I needed to do completely vanished. The boy sitting in my kitchen had miraculously survived a dark nightmare created by the person I had raised. I sat across the table and smiled back at him. My heart was no longer heavy with grief or disappointment. It was hardened by an absolute unbreakable resolve. I was not just going to hand those documents over to a detective and let the slow wheels of the justice system take over. A quiet plea deal or a reduced sentence in a low-security white-collar prison would never be enough to pay for the suffering they had inflicted on this child. I looked at the medical affidavit sitting on my counter. I was not just going to send my son and his wife to jail. I was going to tear down the very foundation of their entire existence. I was going to expose their lies to the world. I was going to humiliate them in front of the high society friends they valued above human life. I was going to ensure that they lost every single penny of their stolen wealth. I was going to scorch their earth until there was absolutely nothing left. I drove away from the clinic with the medical affidavit burning a hole in the passenger seat next to me. I had the physical proof of the abuse and I had the bank records proving the fraud. But I knew that taking these documents straight to a local police precinct would be a massive mistake. Local cops would treat it as a domestic dispute. They would call Child Protective Services, who would immediately notify the registered foster parents. Justin would get a phone call in Hawaii, and before his plane even landed back on the mainland, he would have a team of expensive defense attorneys spinning a web of lies. They would claim the basement was a temporary safety measure for a severely autistic child. They would tie the bank fraud up in civil court for years. I could not let that happen. I needed a legal strike so precise and devastating that they would never see it coming until the handcuffs were already clicking shut. I drove straight into the heart of the city's financial district. I pulled my dusty truck into a parking garage filled with sleek imported sedans. I took the elevator up to the 40th floor of a towering glass building. The receptionist at the front desk looked at my worn flannel jacket and muddy boots with poorly disguised disdain. I ignored her completely and demanded to see Vincent. Vincent is not a family lawyer. He is a ruthless, high-priced corporate litigator and a former federal prosecutor. Years ago, before he moved into this glass tower, he was a young, ambitious lawyer who needed a commercial warehouse built under budget and ahead of schedule to save a failing client. I worked double shifts to get that job done, and Vincent looked me in the eye and told me he owed me a favor. I was here to collect. Vincent walked out of his corner office. He is a sharp, impeccably dressed man who never wastes a single word. He took one look at my face and immediately ushered me inside, closing the heavy oak door behind us. I did not bother with pleasantries. I sat down across from him and began emptying the contents of my manila envelope onto his pristine glass desk. I laid out the forged home equity loan documents first. Then I placed the state foster care forms detailing the $4,500 monthly stipend. Finally, I set down the sworn medical affidavit from Dr. Carter, detailing the severe malnutrition and the traces of sedatives in the 6-year-old boy's bloodstream. Vincent leaned forward. He read through the documents in complete silence. He did not gasp. He did not offer any hollow words of sympathy. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the office was the crisp turning of pages. When he finally looked up, his eyes were cold and calculating. He saw exactly what I saw. He saw a slam-dunk federal case. He picked up a silver pen and began writing rapidly on a legal pad. The plan he laid out was a masterpiece of legal destruction. He explained that if we alerted the state child welfare system through normal channels, it would trigger automatic notifications that would tip Justin off. Instead, Vincent drafted an emergency ex parte guardianship petition. He knew a sympathetic family court judge who owed him a favor. We would file the petition under seal, presenting Dr. Carter's affidavit, to immediately strip Justin and Megan of their foster rights and grant me temporary legal custody of Leo. Because the order was sealed by a judge, the state would not automatically notify the registered foster parents. Justin and Megan would remain completely ignorant that their captive had been legally removed from their custody. But the real trap was the financial fraud. Vincent picked up his office phone and dialed a private number. He did not call the local police. He called a senior federal investigator he had worked with during his days as a prosecutor. Vincent explained that he had ironclad documented proof of a $150,000 wire fraud involving a federally insured bank combined with an ongoing scheme to defraud the state foster care system. He offered the investigator the entire case on a silver platter, but he demanded one specific condition in return. He demanded that they wait to make the arrest. Vincent hung up the phone and looked at me. He explained the psychology of a white-collar criminal. He said that if the FBI arrested Justin at the airport, the moment his flight landed, Justin would immediately invoke his right to remain silent. His lawyers would argue that the forged signature was a misunderstanding, that I had verbally authorized the loan and simply forgot. They would drag it out. Vincent said we needed to force them to panic. We needed them to realize their carefully constructed world was collapsing, and in that panic, we needed them to commit a fresh, undeniable crime that would completely destroy their credibility and eliminate any chance of a plea bargain. The trap was elegantly simple. We were going to let Justin and Megan return from their luxury vacation in Oahu. We were going to let them unlock their front door, drop their designer luggage in the foyer, and walk downstairs to the utility room. We were going to let them turn that heavy deadbolt and push open the door only to find the concrete box completely empty. Vincent leaned back in his chair and smiled a dark, predatory smile. He explained exactly what they would do when they found the boy missing. They could not call the police and report a missing foster child without explaining why he was locked behind a deadbolt in the basement. They could not simply do nothing because the state would eventually expect to see the child they were being paid $4,500 a month to care for. They would be trapped in a corner of their own making. And when cornered, Vincent said liars always lie. He predicted they would scramble to invent a cover story. They would concoct a narrative about a troubled, violent child who picked a lock and ran away in the middle of the night. They would call 911 and lie to the dispatcher. They would lie to the responding officers. They would file a completely fabricated police report to cover their tracks. And the moment they signed their names to that false report, while the FBI already possessed the forged loan documents and the medical affidavit proving their abuse, their fate would be absolutely sealed. The federal prosecutor would have them dead to rights for felony obstruction of justice, utterly destroying any defense their expensive lawyers could ever attempt to mount. I sat in Vincent's office and listened as the guillotine was meticulously constructed. The raw, burning anger that had consumed me the day before had completely vanished. I felt nothing but a cold, heavy resolve. I stood up from the leather chair, shook Vincent's hand, and walked out of the glass tower. The legal machinery was now in motion. The trap was set. All I had to do was return to that pristine, quiet suburban house and install the final pieces of the snare, ensuring that the moment my son realized his captive was gone, every single lie he told would be recorded for the world to see. I had exactly 72 hours before their return flight touched down on the tarmac. Vincent had the legal snare perfectly constructed with the federal investigator, but I needed something more visceral. I needed the undeniable, irrefutable visual proof of their guilt. I needed to capture the exact fraction of a second when the arrogant facade shattered and the sheer panic of a cornered criminal took over. I drove to a specialized electronics retailer on the industrial side of town. I paid cash for 3 high-definition motion-activated micro-cameras equipped with night vision and crisp audio recording capabilities. I bought the kind of equipment private investigators use to catch corporate spies. I threw the small black boxes onto the passenger seat of my truck and drove back to my son's immaculate suburban fortress. The neighborhood was painfully quiet. A landscaper was mowing a lawn 3 houses down, A delivery truck rolled past. Nobody had the slightest idea that a house of horrors sat right in the middle of their perfect community. I let myself in through the garage. The air inside still smelled of that sickeningly sweet vanilla diffuser. I did not waste any time. I grabbed my tool bag and headed straight down the carpeted stairs into the basement. I stood in front of the utility room door. The wood frame was severely splintered where Sam the plumber had forced the heavy deadbolt open with his steel wrench. If Justin and Megan walked downstairs and saw the broken frame, they would instantly know the room had been breached by an intruder. They would call the police and claim a burglar broke into their home and kidnapped their foster child. I could not give them that excuse. I opened my tool bag. 40 years of finishing carpentry makes a man very good at hiding damage. I used a specialized wood filler to pack the deep cracks. I sanded the surface completely smooth, matching the exact contour of the door casing. I pulled a small tin of matching wood stain from my bag and carefully blended the color until the repaired section was completely invisible. I reattached the heavy commercial deadbolt, tightening the screws so the lock functioned flawlessly. From the hallway, the door looked exactly as they had left it. I pushed the door open and stepped into the concrete box. The oppressive smell of the chemical pine air freshener still hung in the air. I climbed up on a small step stool and removed the metal grate covering the air return vent near the ceiling. I positioned the first micro camera deep inside the ductwork. I angled the tiny glass lens so it had a complete unobstructed view of the heavy wooden door, the automatic pet feeder, and the dark, narrow gap behind the massive water heater. I secured the camera with industrial tape and replaced the metal grate. The lens was completely invisible in the shadows. Next, I walked over to the automatic pet feeder sitting on the cold concrete floor. The plastic hopper was nearly empty. I walked upstairs to their pristine kitchen pantry, grabbed a massive box of generic dry cereal, and crushed 3 protein bars into small pieces. I carried the mixture downstairs and dumped it directly into the plastic hopper of the machine. I reset the digital timer. I wanted the machine to function perfectly. I wanted them to unlock that door and hear the dry cereal rattling into the plastic bowl. I wanted them to look into the empty corner and realize their prisoner was gone. I moved out of the basement and walked up to the main floor. I needed to capture their initial entry into the house and the inevitable frantic sprint to the basement once they realized nobody was making noise downstairs. Megan had placed a massive, expensive fake potted plant at the end of the main hallway, right near the top of the basement stairs. I nestled the second micro camera deep inside the thick artificial green leaves. The camera possessed a perfect vantage point of the front door, the foyer, and the staircase. I tested the motion sensor by walking back and forth. A silent notification popped up on my phone, instantly delivering a crystal-clear video feed of the hallway. The final piece of the trap belonged in Justin's home office. When they discovered the boy was missing, they would not stay in the basement. They would run to the office. They would close the door, pace around that glass desk, and scramble to invent a cover story. I slipped into the office and walked over to the floating shelves mounted on the wall. The shelves were lined with thick, expensive hardcover books that had clearly never been read, placed there purely for decoration. I pushed 2 heavy volumes slightly apart and wedged the third micro camera into the narrow gap. The lens pointed directly at the glass desk and the leather ergonomic chair. I synced all 3 cameras to a secure encrypted application on my laptop. I stood in the center of the office and listened to my own breathing. The digital trap was completely invisible. It was waiting quietly in the walls of their home, ready to broadcast their destruction. I wiped down every surface I had touched, locked the front door, and drove away. That evening, I sat in the worn recliner in my quiet cabin on the edge of town. The fire was crackling softly in the wood stove. The contrast between the cold, calculated snare I had just built across town and the warmth of my own home was staggering. My cell phone vibrated on the side table. The screen lit up with a text message from Megan. I opened the message. It was a high-resolution photograph of her and Justin. They were sitting on the pristine white deck of a luxury catamaran. The crystal-clear blue waters of the Pacific Ocean stretched out behind them. They were both wearing expensive sunglasses, their skin tanned, holding bright tropical cocktails up to the camera. They looked like the absolute picture of carefree wealth and happiness. Beneath the photograph was a caption written with her usual condescending arrogance. "Just checking to see if you watered the orchids and checked the mail like a good dad. We are exhausted from the sun. See you Tuesday." I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. The sheer, unadulterated evil required to smile on a yacht, while a machine dropped dry cereal to a starving child locked in a concrete box, was something my mind simply refused to process. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I wanted to scream through the digital connection. I wanted to tell them the police were already sharpening the knives. I wanted to shatter their tropical paradise. But Vincent had warned me that the trap required absolute discipline. I had to let them walk willingly into the snare. I typed out a response, keeping my face completely devoid of emotion. I typed a single, simple sentence. "Everything is exactly where it belongs." I hit send. I put the phone face down on the table and let out a long, heavy breath. I looked up from my chair. Across the small room sitting at my rustic kitchen table was Leo. Evelyn had gone home for the night, and the boy was wearing a thick, warm sweater I had bought for him. He was completely focused on a piece of blank white paper. I had given him a large box of crayons after dinner. He was not hiding in the shadows anymore. He was sitting in the bright, warm light of the kitchen. I watched as he picked up a bright yellow crayon and began dragging it across the paper in wide, sweeping arcs. He was drawing a sun. It was a simple, beautiful thing. The child who had been buried in the dark was drawing light. I opened my laptop and placed it on my lap. The screen divided into 3 separate video feeds: the dark basement utility room, the silent hallway, the empty home office. The feeds were completely still, completely silent. I watched Leo color his picture, listening to the soft scraping of the wax against the paper, while the digital trap across town lay perfectly in wait, quietly ticking down the final hours until the monsters finally came home. The digital clock on my laptop screen flipped to 3 in the afternoon on Tuesday. I sat in my worn recliner with the laptop resting on my knees. The 3 video feeds displayed the silent, empty rooms of my son's house. I had sent Leo to the kitchen to help Evelyn bake cookies. I did not want the boy anywhere near the screen when his captors finally came home. The cabin was filled with the warm smell of sugar and butter. It was a stark contrast to the cold, digital trap I was monitoring. Suddenly, the motion sensor alert chimed softly. The hallway camera feed blinked to life. The heavy front door swung open, letting in a flood of bright afternoon sunlight. Justin and Megan stepped into the foyer. They looked exactly like the picture they had texted me. Their skin was baked a golden bronze from 2 weeks of tropical sun. They wore expensive sunglasses and linen resort wear. Justin dropped 2 massive designer suitcases onto the polished hardwood floor. The heavy bags landed with a dull thud that echoed through the quiet house. Megan kicked off her sandals, stretching her arms above her head with a loud, theatrical sigh of relief. They were home. They were back in their pristine suburban fortress. Any normal person returning from a long trip while leaving a living creature behind would immediately check on them. A neighbor checking on a dog would go straight to the kennel. But my son and his wife did not even glance toward the basement door. They did not drop their bags and rush downstairs to see if the little boy they had locked in a concrete box was still breathing. Instead, Justin walked casually into the kitchen. The camera caught him opening the stainless steel refrigerator, pulling out a cold imported beer and twisting off the cap. He took a long, satisfied drink. Megan collapsed onto the plush living room sofa. She immediately pulled out her smartphone. Her thumbs moved rapidly across the screen. She was likely uploading the final batch of vacation photos to her social media accounts, bragging to thousands of strangers about their perfect child-free life. I sat in my cabin and watched them for 2 agonizing hours. 2 full hours. They unpacked their suitcases. They sorted their laundry. Justin took a long hot shower upstairs. Megan ordered expensive sushi delivery from a restaurant downtown. They moved around the house with the relaxed, arrogant ease of people who believed they were completely untouchable. They laughed. They ate their expensive food at the kitchen island. They acted as if the utility room in their basement did not exist. Every minute that passed without them checking on Leo cemented the absolute hatred I felt for them. It proved that the boy was nothing more than a forgotten piece of machinery, to them a machine that quietly generated cash while they lived their luxury lives. Finally, just as the sun began to set and the shadows lengthened in the hallway, Justin stood up from the kitchen stool. He stretched his back, muttered something to Megan about doing a quick check, and walked toward the basement door. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm. I leaned closer to the laptop screen. The camera hidden inside the artificial plant at the top of the stairs captured Justin walking down. He was holding his half-empty beer bottle in one hand. He moved with a lazy, careless stride. He reached the bottom of the carpeted stairs and turned the corner. The second camera feed, the one hidden inside the air return vent in the basement, picked him up perfectly. Justin walked straight to the utility room. He did not look worried. He looked annoyed, like a man forced to take out the trash after a long day. He reached out and grasped the heavy commercial deadbolt. I held my breath. I watched as his fingers turned the metal latch. The sharp mechanical click of the lock sliding open echoed through the audio feed. Justin pushed the solid wood door inward. The harsh yellow light from the hallway spilled into the small concrete box. He stepped into the doorway and looked down. He expected to see a terrified, silent little boy huddled behind the water heater. He expected to hear the automated pet feeder rattling out a handful of dry cereal, but the room was completely empty. The pile of frayed moving blankets was flat. The water heater hummed quietly. There was no child. The transformation on my son's face was instantaneous and horrifying. The relaxed tropical glow vanished from his skin in a fraction of a second. He dropped his beer bottle. The glass shattered against the concrete floor, splashing amber liquid in jagged shards everywhere. He did not care. He took 2 frantic steps into the cramped room, his eyes darting wildly from the bucket in the corner to the empty space behind the metal tank. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the broken glass cutting into his skin. He shoved the moving blankets aside blindly, reaching into the dark gap, as if the boy had somehow melted into the concrete. When his hands found nothing but cold, empty air, he scrambled backward. The look on his face was captured in high definition. It was not the panicked, heartbroken expression of a father realizing his son was missing. It was the raw, unadulterated terror of a white-collar criminal realizing the evidence of his massive fraud had completely vanished. He knew instantly what this meant. Without the boy, there were no foster checks. Without the foster checks, the bank would foreclose on the fraudulent home equity loan. His entire empire of lies was crumbling in front of his eyes. Justin scrambled to his feet, slipping on the wet concrete. He burst out of the utility room, leaving the door wide open. He sprinted toward the stairs. The camera caught him taking the steps 2 at a time, his chest heaving, his face a mask of absolute panic. "Megan!" He screamed her name. The sound was guttural and raw, ripping through the quiet house. "Megan!" The hallway camera picked him up as he burst into the living room. Megan jumped up from the plush sofa, startled by the sheer volume of his voice. She dropped her phone onto the cushions. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight with sudden alarm. "What happened?" "He is gone!" Justin gasped, pointing a shaking finger back toward the basement door. The lock was closed, but the room is empty. He is not down there. Megan froze. The color drained completely from her face. She stared at Justin for 3 full seconds, while her brain processed the catastrophic reality of his words. When she finally moved, she did not run toward the basement to search for the boy. She did not cry out in worry for a 6-year-old child who was supposedly wandering alone. Her reaction was purely sickeningly financial. She lunged forward and grabbed Justin by the collar of his expensive linen shirt. "What do you mean he is gone?" She shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly through the hidden microphones. "How can he be gone? The deadbolt was locked. You said nobody could get that door open." "I do not know," Justin yelled back, pushing her hands away. "I checked everywhere. The blankets are there, the feeder is there, but he is gone." Megan began to pace frantically back and forth across the expensive hardwood floor. She was pulling at her hair, her breathing quick and shallow. "The monthly stipends," she gasped, staring at the floor. "The state deposits those checks on the 1st of the month. If the caseworker calls for a surprise inspection and we do not have him here, they will cut off the funding. They will demand to see the child, Justin. How are we going to pay the bank next week?" "They will not just cut off the funding!" Justin shouted, his panic escalating into a full-blown frenzy. "If the state finds out he is missing, they will send the police. They will look at the utility room. They will see the bucket and the lock. We will go to prison, Megan. They will lock us up." I sat in my quiet cabin and watched the two of them unravel. They were pacing like caged animals. They were screaming at each other, trading vicious insults, entirely focused on the $4,500 they were about to lose. Neither of them mentioned Leo's safety. Neither of them wondered if the boy was hungry, cold, or hurt. Their only concern was the impending collapse of their luxury lifestyle and the terrifying prospect of a federal prison cell. They were completely trapped, exactly as Vincent the lawyer had predicted. They could not call the police without exposing the concrete cage in the basement. They could not remain silent because the state would eventually notice the missing child. They were being crushed by the weight of their own greed. I reached over and closed my laptop screen. I did not need to watch the rest of their panicked argument. The snare had officially closed around their ankles. Now they were going to do exactly what desperate criminals always do. They were going to try and lie their way out of a burning building, and I was going to be standing right outside the door, ready to strike the final match. I watched the live video feeds on my laptop as the panic in my son's house shifted from a rolling boil into absolute chaos. Justin and Megan did not stop to consider how a frail 6-year-old boy could have possibly unlatched a heavy commercial deadbolt from the inside of a windowless concrete box. Their minds were entirely consumed by the terrifying prospect of losing their state-funded income. The hallway camera captured them, tearing through the pristine house like frantic scavengers. They flung open the doors to the guest bedrooms, tossing expensive linens onto the floor. They checked the custom walk-in closets, shoving designer coats aside. Justin ran out to the immaculate garage, throwing open the doors to his luxury sedan and checking the trunk. Megan was running up and down the carpeted stairs, her bare feet slapping against the wood, her face twisted into a mask of pure desperation. They searched every single corner of that massive suburban fortress. They were looking for a lost revenue stream, not a lost child. When they finally realized that Leo was completely gone, that he was not hiding under a bed or shivering behind a washing machine, the exhaustion of their panic began to set in. They stumbled back into the hallway. Their tropical tans looked sallow and gray under the recessed lighting. Justin was sweating profusely, his expensive linen shirt clinging to his back. Megan was chewing on her thumbnail, a nervous habit she only exhibited when she knew she was caught in a lie. They needed a secure place to strategize, a place where they felt in control. They walked into the home office and shut the door behind them. The third micro-camera, carefully wedged between the decorative books on the floating shelf, captured every single detail in high definition. The audio feed was crystal clear. Justin collapsed into his leather ergonomic chair, burying his face in his hands. He looked like a man staring directly down the barrel of a loaded gun. Megan began pacing back and forth in front of the glass desk, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Justin looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wide. He suggested calling me. He told Megan that I was the only other person who had the garage code. He reasoned that I had been at the house a few days ago to let the plumber in, and maybe I had noticed something out of the ordinary. My thumb hovered over the keyboard of my laptop, waiting for him to make the call. If he dialed my number, I would have answered. I would have let him spin his web of lies directly into my ear. But Megan stopped him instantly. She slammed her hand flat against the glass desk, the loud smack echoing through the hidden microphone. She told Justin that calling his father was the stupidest thing he could possibly do. She reminded him that I asked too many questions. If they called me, I would drive right over. I would demand to see the basement. I would see the bucket, the automatic feeder, and the heavy lock. Megan explicitly stated that bringing me into the house was a guaranteed way to end up in federal prison. Justin swallowed hard and nodded, completely submitting to her logic. They had to handle this themselves. They had to build a wall of lies so thick that the authorities would never see the concrete box hidden behind it. I sat in my quiet cabin and watched my own flesh and blood meticulously engineer a federal crime. Megan took control of the narrative. She grabbed a legal pad and a silver pen from the desk and began writing down their alibi. They could not possibly tell the police they had been drinking cocktails on a catamaran in Oahu for the past 2 weeks. If the state discovered they had abandoned a high-needs foster child to go on a luxury vacation, they would be arrested on the spot. They needed a timeline that covered only the last few hours. Megan decided they had simply gone on a quick grocery run to the organic market across town. It was a perfectly mundane, innocent excuse. Justin asked how they would explain the open deadbolt on the utility room door. Megan did not even blink. She crafted a story about a troubled, deceitful child. She told Justin they would claim Leo was a mastermind escape artist. They would tell the police the boy had severe behavioral issues, that he was violent, and that he had somehow managed to pick the heavy lock from the inside while they were sleeping upstairs earlier that afternoon. They rehearsed the story line by line. They practiced the exact tone of voice they would use. Megan coached Justin on which specific medical buzzwords to drop to the dispatcher. She told him to emphasize the falsified autism diagnosis to make the authorities believe they were dealing with a deeply unstable child who was a danger to himself. They were weaving a narrative designed to paint themselves as exhausted, loving caregivers who were simply overwhelmed by a difficult foster placement. Justin picked up his smartphone. His hand was trembling, but as he dialed the 3 digits for emergency services, his entire demeanor shifted. I watched him physically transform into a grieving, terrified father. The audio feed picked up the faint voice of the 911 dispatcher answering the call. Justin took a deep, shuddering breath and began to weep. It was a flawless performance. The fake tears rolled down his cheeks as he choked out his rehearsed lines. He told the dispatcher that his disabled foster son had wandered off. He played the part of the panicked protector perfectly, his voice cracking exactly when it needed to. He fed the dispatcher the lie about the quick grocery run. He smoothly inserted the fabricated detail about the picked lock, painting a picture of a chaotic, uncontrollable boy who had vanished into the suburban streets. He begged the dispatcher to send units quickly, claiming the boy was entirely nonverbal and incapable of asking for help. Megan stood next to the desk, her arms crossed, nodding in silent approval as her husband delivered the fraudulent story. She reached out and rubbed his shoulder, playing the role of the supportive, devastated wife. They were not crying for Leo. They were crying for their $4,500 monthly stipend. They were crying to save their sports cars and their imported orchids. I watched the entire phone call unfold on my glowing screen. I did not feel a single trace of sorrow. I felt nothing but a cold, absolute certainty. Justin hung up the phone and wiped his dry eyes. He looked at Megan and let out a long, heavy breath of relief. They actually believed they had gotten away with it. They actually believed their polished, wealthy aesthetic would shield them from the truth. They had absolutely no idea that every single word of their fabricated story, every fake tear, and every calculated lie had been captured in high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. By dialing that number and feeding false information to a police dispatcher to cover up their neglect, they had just committed felony obstruction of justice and filed a false police report. They had handed the federal prosecutor the exact ammunition needed to ensure they would never see the outside of a prison cell again. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. The screen lit up in the dim light of the cabin. It was a text message from Vincent, the corporate litigator I had hired. He had tapped into his network and received word from his federal investigator contact that the local police dispatch had just logged a missing persons report at Justin's exact address. The text message contained no words. It was just a single thumbs-up icon. The trap had officially snapped shut. The legal guillotine was perfectly positioned directly over their necks. I closed my laptop screen, letting the darkness fill the room. My son had built an empire of lies, and I was holding the sledgehammer that was going to smash it all to dust. I stayed glued to my laptop screen as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the front window of my son's house. 2 local patrol officers walked up the perfectly swept driveway. They were young, completely unaware that they were stepping into a masterclass of manipulation. The hallway camera fed me every agonizing second of the interaction. Justin opened the front door with red eyes and a trembling jaw. Megan stood right behind him, clutching a tissue to her chest, playing the part of the exhausted, heartbroken mother. They invited the officers inside and began spinning the exact web of lies they had rehearsed in the home office. Justin handed them a printed photograph of Leo. He repeated the fabricated medical profile, emphasizing the fake autism diagnosis and the imaginary history of violent outbursts. He told the officers that the boy was a frequent runaway, an uncontrollable force that they were simply struggling to contain. The officers nodded sympathetically. They did not ask to see the basement. They did not question why a heavy deadbolt was installed on a utility room door. Because my son and his wife were wealthy, well-dressed, and lived in a pristine suburban neighborhood, they were automatically given the benefit of the doubt. The police took down the information in their small notebooks, promised to circulate the photo to patrol cars in the area, and assured Justin they would search the nearby parks. It was treated as a standard runaway case, completely devoid of urgency. As soon as the officers stepped out the door and the latch clicked shut, the performance ended instantly. The tears vanished from Megan's face. Justin let out a long breath and walked straight back to the kitchen to pour himself another drink. They actually smiled at each other. They believed they had won. I sat in my cabin, my blood running cold at their absolute lack of humanity. I expected them to lay low. I expected them to spend the next few days acting the part of worried parents sitting by the phone in case the police called. I underestimated the sheer depth of their narcissism. The audio feed from the living room picked up their next conversation. Justin asked if they should postpone the massive welcome back party they had planned for the following afternoon. Megan immediately shot the idea down. She paced across the expensive rug, arguing that canceling a massive event at the last minute would raise too many questions. She insisted that their friends, a curated circle of wealthy influencers and social climbers, expected a flawless Hawaiian-themed luau. She said they needed to maintain their perfect lifestyle brand. Nothing, not even a missing child, was going to stop her from showing off her tropical tan. The next morning, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I had just finished making a plate of pancakes for Leo. I picked up the device and read a text message from Justin. It was casual, entirely devoid of the panic he had faked for the police just hours prior. He reminded me that the party started at 2 in the afternoon. He asked me to pick up 4 bags of crushed ice on my way over. There was no mention of a missing boy. There was no plea for comfort from his father. It was just a cold, transactional demand. I looked at the message, then looked at Leo sitting safely at my wooden table covered in maple syrup and smiling at a cartoon on the television. I typed a brief reply confirming I would bring the ice. I was not going to miss this party for anything in the world. I pulled my truck into their neighborhood the next afternoon. The street was lined with expensive imported SUVs and luxury sedans. I parked a block away and carried the heavy bags of ice up the driveway. I could hear the loud, pulsing tropical music before I even reached the backyard gate. I pushed the wooden gate open and stepped into a manufactured paradise. The backyard had been transformed into an elaborate, sickeningly cheerful luau. Bamboo tiki torches lined the perimeter of the manicured lawn. A massive catered buffet was set up under a white canopy featuring roasted pork, fresh fruit displays, and flowing chocolate fountains. There were at least 70 guests spread across the patio. These were the shallowest people I had ever seen gathered in one place. Women in expensive sundresses and oversized hats were taking pictures of themselves holding hollowed-out pineapples. Men in crisp polo shirts and expensive loafers were laughing loudly, swapping stories about golf handicaps and stock portfolios. The sheer contrast between the bright, vibrant celebration happening on the lawn and the dark concrete cage hidden just a few feet below their designer shoes made me feel physically ill. None of these people knew the truth. They only saw the glossy, filtered version of reality that Justin and Megan sold to them. I spotted my son and his wife holding court near the outdoor bar. They were the absolute center of attention. They looked like royalty returning from a victorious conquest. Justin was wearing a floral shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his skin glowing from the Oahu sun. He was holding a brightly colored cocktail, tossing his head back in a booming laugh at a joke someone had just told. Megan stood beside him, resting her hand lightly on his chest. She wore a flowing white dress that caught the afternoon breeze. They were playing the part of the perfect sun-kissed wildly successful couple flawlessly. I walked closer, blending into the crowd, carrying my bags of ice. I stopped a few feet away, obscured by a group of laughing guests, and listened to their conversation. A woman in a wide-brimmed hat asked Megan how their nephew was doing. She did not even use his name. Megan smiled a bright, practiced smile. She leaned in closer to the woman and lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. She explained that it was just too difficult to bring him along on a romantic getaway. She smoothly lied, telling the group that they had paid for him to attend a highly exclusive, expensive therapeutic camp for special needs children while they were in Hawaii. She sighed softly, playing the role of the exhausted but generous caretaker. The women in the group cooed in sympathy. They told Megan she was a saint for taking on such a heavy burden. They told Justin he was an incredible husband for supporting her. I listened to them congratulate each other on their fabricated charity. It was a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation. They were collecting praise for locking a starving child in a windowless room. The rage inside me was no longer a hot, burning fire. It had compressed into something dense and frozen. It was a heavy block of ice sitting right in the center of my chest. I walked past the group and headed straight for the large stainless steel coolers sitting near the catering tent. I dumped the bags of ice inside, the sound of the cascading cubes barely registering over the loud, pulsing music. I reached into the cooler and pulled out a simple bottle of sparkling water. I twisted the cap off the sharp hiss of carbonation, grounding me in the present moment. I did not mingle. I did not speak to the guests. I retreated to a quiet corner of the patio, standing in the shadow of a large decorative palm tree. I took a slow drink of the cold water and let my eyes sweep across the crowded yard. I watched Justin raise his glass to toast another guest. I watched Megan laugh, throwing her head back in the warm sunlight as she showed off her new designer necklace. They were completely insulated by their wealth and their lies. I stood completely still, watching the illusion reach its absolute peak. The stage was perfectly set. The audience was completely captivated by the performance. I leaned against the wooden fence, feeling the cold glass bottle in my hand, and waited patiently for the final curtain to fall. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly on the manicured lawn, casting long shadows across the imported stone patio. The air was thick with the smell of roasted pork, sweet pineapple, and the suffocating perfume of 70 wealthy guests. I stood completely still in the shade of a massive decorative palm tree, gripping the cold bottle of sparkling water in my hand. I watched the scene unfold like a poorly written stage play. The laughter was too loud, the smiles were too wide, and every interaction felt entirely transactional. These people did not care about my son or his wife. They only cared about proximity to perceived success. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the pulsing tropical music. It was the high-pitched ring of a silver spoon, repeatedly tapping against the rim of a crystal champagne flute. The heavy bass of the music faded away into nothing. The chatter of the crowd quieted down. All eyes turned toward the raised teak deck at the center of the yard. Justin stood there, glowing in the afternoon light. He wore a crisp, unbuttoned floral shirt that caught the gentle breeze. Megan was glued to his side, her white designer dress flowing perfectly around her tanned legs. She rested her head on his shoulder, gazing up at him, with an expression of pure, fabricated adoration. Justin smiled at the crowd, letting the silence stretch out, just long enough to ensure every single person was hanging on his every word. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice booming effortlessly across the yard. He had the smooth, practiced delivery of a corporate salesman pitching a hollow product. "Megan and I are just so incredibly blessed to be surrounded by such amazing friends. As you all know, we just got back from 2 weeks in absolute paradise." A few people in the crowd cheered and raised their glasses. Justin chuckled, a rich, warm sound that made my stomach churn violently. He went on to describe the crystal-clear waters of Oahu, the luxury catamaran they had chartered, and the expensive dinners they had eaten under the stars. He painted a picture of absolute carefree wealth. But he did not stop there. He could never just stop at bragging about a vacation. His ego demanded moral superiority. "You know, trips like this really make you step back and appreciate what matters most." Justin continued, his tone shifting into something sickeningly earnest. He placed his hand over his heart. "It makes you appreciate family. It makes you appreciate the hard work it takes to build a beautiful life. Megan and I have sacrificed so much to get where we are. We have worked day and night to build this home, to turn it into a sanctuary of peace and love." The hypocrisy hung in the humid air, so thick and foul, it felt like breathing in exhaust fumes. He was standing on a deck I had built with my own 2 hands, boasting about his hard work. He was calling this house a sanctuary of peace and love, while just 20 feet below his imported leather loafers sat a windowless concrete box fitted with a commercial deadbolt and a plastic bucket. He was preaching about family, while the little boy he had locked in the dark was sitting safely in my cabin, still flinching at sudden movements. I felt my jaw clench so tight my teeth ached. The block of ice in my chest began to crack, giving way to a cold, overwhelming surge of absolute resolve. Justin raised his crystal flute high above his head. "So here is a toast," he announced, his eyes sweeping across the adoring crowd. "To good friends, to endless success, and to building a beautiful life with the woman of my dreams. Cheers." "Cheers," the crowd echoed in unison. 70 crystal glasses clinked together in a wave of blind validation. I let the sound die down for exactly 3 seconds. Then I stepped out from the deep shadow of the palm tree. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, methodical, heavy steps of a man walking to an execution. The crowd parted naturally as I moved through them. They stepped aside, their expensive perfumes and colognes parting like the Red Sea. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the raised teak deck. I reached the bottom of the wooden steps and stopped. I looked up at the man I had raised. Justin lowered his champagne glass. His perfectly practiced smile widened as he looked down at me. "Dad?" He called out, his voice dripping with fake enthusiasm. "You made it. Everyone, my dad is here. The man who taught me how to swing a hammer." A polite scattering of applause rippled through the nearest guests. Megan beamed down at me, holding her glass of champagne elegantly by the stem. I did not smile back. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with a deep, resonant clarity that carried easily across the sudden quiet of the patio. "I brought the ice you asked for," I said slowly, "and I also brought something else. I thought this was the perfect time to share it with everyone." Justin tilted his head, his smile remaining frozen in place. "Oh yeah. What did you bring, Dad?" I reached inside the inner pocket of my heavy flannel jacket. My hand closed around the thick manila envelope I had prepared that morning. I pulled it out. The heavy paper felt substantial in my grip. I brought some souvenir photos I said my eyes never leaving his face. I got them developed this morning. They are pictures from inside the house. I thought your friends would really love to see exactly how you live when the cameras are turned off. Justin let out a relaxed, clueless laugh. He actually thought I had printed out pictures of his newly renovated kitchen, or maybe some old embarrassing childhood photos to share as a joke. "Oh man," he chuckled, looking out at the crowd. "All right, let us see what he dug up. Be kind to me, everyone." But Megan did not laugh. Her survival instinct was much sharper than his. I watched as her eyes darted from the thick envelope to my face. She saw the absolute dead emptiness in my stare. She saw the posture of my shoulders. The bright sun-kissed warmth drained out of her face in a fraction of a second. Her smile faltered, her lips parting slightly as a sudden creeping realization washed over her. She knew I had a spare key. She knew I had been in the house. I did not hand the envelope up to the deck. Instead, I turned to my left. Standing right beside the stairs was a tall man in a tailored blue polo shirt. He was one of Justin's most prominent business associates, a man who loved to gossip and post every detail of his life online. I held the thick manila envelope out to him. "Do me a favor," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "Open this up and pass them around. Make sure everyone gets a really good look." The man in the blue shirt smiled, eager to be part of the joke. He took the envelope from my hand. He slid his manicured thumb under the flap and ripped the paper open. I stood at the bottom of the teak stairs, my hands hanging loosely at my sides. I watched the man pull out the thick stack of high-definition glossy photographs. I did not need to see the pictures to know exactly what was printed on them. I knew the image of the concrete wall, the metal water tank, the timed automatic pet feeder, and the heavy exterior deadbolt were about to see the light of day. I waited in the deafening sunlit silence, watching the man's eyes drop down to the very first photograph. The man in the blue shirt pulls the thick stack of glossy paper from the manila envelope. He has a wide, easy smile on his face, expecting to see an embarrassing childhood photograph or a funny holiday card. I watch his eyes carefully. The careless smile melts off his face in an absolute instant. It is replaced by a deep, bewildered frown. He is holding a high-resolution 8x10 photograph of the concrete utility room. The image is mercilessly clear. It shows the heavy exterior deadbolt mounted backward on the solid wood door. It shows the plastic bucket lined with a black garbage bag sitting in the corner. Most damning of all, it shows the automatic pet feeder, its clear plastic hopper filled to the brim with dry generic cereal and crushed protein bars. The man blinks rapidly, trying to process what he is looking at. He does not understand. He thinks it is a strange, tasteless prank, but the grim, sterile horror of the image is far too real. He slowly hands the photograph to the woman standing next to him. She is wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and holding a paper plate loaded with roasted pork and fresh fruit. She glances casually at the picture. Her breath catches audibly in her throat. She drops her plate directly onto the pristine green grass. The food spills everywhere, but she does not even notice. She is staring in sheer horror at the image of the frayed moving blankets wedged behind the massive water heater. The man in the blue shirt reaches into the envelope and pulls out the next item. It is not a photograph. It is a stark black and white copy of the bank documents. It is the home equity line of credit agreement. I had used a bright yellow marker to highlight the $150,000 loan amount and the expertly forged signature at the very bottom of the page. This man works in finance. I can tell by the way his eyes immediately scan the routing numbers and the authorization seals. He recognizes legitimate loan origination documents instantly. He sees my printed name. He looks up at me standing completely still at the bottom of the stairs, and then he looks at Justin standing up on the teak deck. The man hands the bank papers to another guest. The thick stack of evidence begins to split up. The photographs and the financial records circulate through the crowd like a highly contagious virus. The upbeat tropical music is still pulsing brightly from the expensive outdoor speakers, but the joyful, arrogant chatter of the luxury party vanishes completely. It is replaced by a rising tide of frantic, horrified whispers. 70 guests are passing around undeniable high-definition proof of child abuse and federal wire fraud. I stand perfectly still in the warm afternoon sun and watch the contagion spread from person to person. I see women covering their mouths with their hands in absolute shock. I see men exchanging grim, disgusted looks as they read the highlighted portions of the bank fraud. The crowd begins to physically recoil from the center of the yard. They take slow, unconscious steps backward, widening the gap between themselves and the raised wooden deck. They are creating a quarantine zone around my son and his wife. Justin is still standing under the white canopy. He holds his crystal champagne flute loosely in his hand. He is waiting for the punchline of the joke. He expects the crowd to burst into laughter, but the laughter never comes. He finally notices the sudden drastic shift in the atmosphere. He sees his wealthy friends whispering urgently to one another. He sees their eyes darting from the glossy papers in their hands up to his face. The easy, confident posture drains entirely out of his body. He lowers his glass. He walks down the wooden steps, his leather shoes clicking softly against the imported stone patio. He approaches a man in a crisp white polo shirt who is staring blankly at a close-up photograph of the heavy exterior deadbolt. Justin reaches out and snatches the photograph right out of the man's hands. He looks down at the glossy paper. I watch the blood drain from my son's face so fast. He looks exactly like a corpse. His tropical tan suddenly appears gray and sickly. His breathing stops completely. He stares at the image of the automated cage he built with his own 2 hands. He recognizes the concrete walls. He recognizes the automatic feeder. He knows instantly that his entire empire of lies is over. Up on the deck, Megan realizes something is catastrophically wrong. The crowd is staring at them with pure, unadulterated revulsion. She walks toward the edge of the stairs. She looks down at the photograph trembling in Justin's hand. She sees the undeniable proof of their hidden dungeon being passed around her pristine backyard. Her fingers go entirely limp. The crystal champagne flute slips from her grasp. It hits the imported stone patio and shatters into 1,000 sparkling pieces. The sharp crash of breaking glass rings out sharply over the music, but nobody flinches. Nobody moves to help her clean it up. Justin looks up from the photograph. His eyes are wide, bloodshot, and filled with a raw, suffocating panic. He looks at me standing at the edge of the crowd. He opens his mouth, but his jaw just trembles uselessly. "Dad." He stammers, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic whisper. "Dad. What is this?" He is pleading with me to save him. He wants me to tell the crowd it is a misunderstanding. He wants me to provide an excuse, a cover story, a lifeline. He wants the father who always fixed his mistakes to fix this one too. I do not lower my voice. I do not show an ounce of mercy. I draw a deep breath and speak loud enough to ensure that every single person in that massive backyard hears my words over the pounding tropical bass. "That is the cage you kept a 6-year-old boy in," I say, my voice cutting through the humid air like a scythe. "So you could steal his foster checks to pay for your vacation." The reaction is instantaneous. The frantic whispering stops completely. Even the upbeat music seems to fade into total nothingness. The silence that falls over the garden is absolute, heavy, and suffocating. No one moves, no one breathes. 70 pairs of eyes lock onto Justin and Megan with pure disgust. The glossy, perfect illusion they have spent years meticulously building shatters just like the glass on the patio floor. The wealthy friends they invited to celebrate their success are now staring at 2 absolute monsters. I stand my ground, my hands relaxed at my sides, watching the utter destruction of my son's life unfold exactly as I designed it. Justin opens his mouth to speak, but no sound comes out. He searches the faces of his wealthy friends looking for a single drop of sympathy or understanding. He finds absolutely nothing in their eyes except pure revulsion. Before he can even attempt to string together a pathetic lie to explain away the photographs circulating through the crowd, a loud metallic clank echoes across the yard. The heavy wooden gate at the side of the house swings wide open, hitting the brick wall with a violent thud that makes several people jump. 4 figures step onto the pristine green lawn. Leading the group is Vincent, my corporate litigator, dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit. He walks with the supreme confidence of an apex predator who has just cornered his prey in the wild. Flanking him on either side are 2 massive uniformed police officers, their hands resting casually on their heavy-duty tactical belts. Walking right behind them is a stern-looking man in a plain windbreaker. He wears a lanyard around his neck, displaying a bright silver federal investigator badge. The guests do not just step aside to let them through. They physically recoil as if the patio has suddenly caught fire. The men and women who were just toasting to Justin and his beautiful life now scramble backward, knocking over patio chairs and dropping plates of expensive catered food onto the grass. They treat my son and his wife like they are carrying a highly infectious disease. Nobody wants to be standing anywhere near them when the authorities finally strike. The crowd presses themselves against the wooden fences, leaving Justin and Megan completely isolated on the edge of the imported stone patio. Vincent does not rush his approach. He walks slowly across the grass, his polished leather shoes crunching softly against the fallen tropical flowers. He stops right in front of Justin. He reaches into his tailored suit jacket and pulls out a thick stack of folded legal papers. He holds them out in the warm sun. Justin simply stares at the papers, his arms hanging limp at his sides. He is trembling so violently that he cannot even lift his hands to take them. Vincent simply drops the papers right onto Justin's chest, allowing them to scatter across the stone tiles around their feet. Vincent speaks in a loud, clear voice that carries across the entire silent yard. He tells Justin that those papers are a formal and immediate eviction notice. He explains that the bank has officially foreclosed on the home equity line of credit due to immediate fraud detection. He states that the financial institution verified the forged signature just hours ago, and they have legally seized the property and all its contents. Vincent looks at Megan and tells her that they no longer own this beautiful sanctuary. He tells them they do not even own the grass they are currently standing on. Justin looks down at the scattered eviction papers, his chest heaving with frantic, shallow breaths. He looks past the lawyers and the police officers, finding me standing quietly in the shadows. He begs me to stop this. He cries out that I am his father, and I am supposed to protect him from things like this. I do not move a single muscle. I tell him that I am protecting the only person in this family who actually needed it. I tell him that Leo is safe and fed and sleeping in a warm bed far away from this house. The man in the plain windbreaker steps forward to stand next to Vincent. He introduces himself as a federal investigator. He does not use a soft or polite tone. He speaks with absolute, unwavering authority. He announces that the 2 uniformed officers are here to execute federal arrest warrants. He lists the charges one by one, letting each felony sink into the humid afternoon air. He states that Justin is being charged with first-degree wire fraud for forging a signature on a federally insured bank loan. He adds the charge of severe child endangerment for locking a minor in a hazardous environment. Finally, he announces the charge of filing a false police report for the fabricated emergency call they made just yesterday. The reality of the federal charges hits the patio like a physical shockwave. Wire fraud alone carries a massive prison sentence. Combined with the child abuse and the obstruction of justice, my son is looking at spending the best years of his life behind reinforced steel bars. The tropical music has been completely turned off by a caterer. The only sound in the backyard is the soft rustling of the palm trees and the ragged, panicked breathing of my son and his wife. Megan finally breaks under the crushing weight of reality. The polished, confident influencer facade shatters into a million jagged pieces right in front of everyone. She looks at the federal investigator, and then she turns her head to look at her husband. She does not stand by his side. She does not hold his hand and promise they will get through this nightmare together. Instead, she takes a large, deliberate step away from him, as if his very presence is toxic. Megan begins to scream. Her voice is shrill and hysterical, echoing painfully against the walls of the surrounding houses. She points a perfectly manicured finger directly at Justin's face. She yells to the police officers that she had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. She screams that keeping the boy in the basement was entirely his idea from the very beginning. She cries out that Justin forced her to buy the automatic feeder and that he was the one who installed the heavy deadbolt on the utility room door. She claims she was terrified of him and that she was a helpless victim of his controlling, abusive behavior. Justin stares at his wife in absolute disbelief. The woman he had just toasted to the woman he had stolen $150,000 to please is now feeding him directly to the wolves to save her own skin. The shock on his face quickly twists into pure venomous rage. His face turns bright red as he lunges toward her, screaming at the top of his lungs. He calls her a greedy parasite. He yells that she was the one who demanded the tropical vacations and the designer clothes they could not afford. He tells the crowd that she was the one who complained about the boy crying and demanded he be locked in the dark room so she could sleep in peace. They stand on their beautiful stone patio, tearing each other apart like wild animals trapped in a cage. They air every dirty secret, every selfish motivation, and every disgusting decision they made together. They are handing the federal prosecutor an absolute goldmine of confessions right in front of 70 witnesses. The police officers do not care about their domestic argument. They do not care who originated the plan or who bought the heavy lock. They step forward with military precision. The larger officer grabs Justin by the shoulder of his expensive floral shirt. He spins my son around violently, forcing his arms behind his back. Justin struggles for a brief second, but the officer kicks his legs apart and shoves him hard against the wooden railing of the deck. The harsh metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists is the loudest sound in the world. It is the sound of absolute finality. Megan tries to back away, holding her hands up in the air. She begs the second officer to listen to her, pleading that she is an innocent bystander. The officer ignores her completely. He grabs her wrists, pulls them behind her flowing white dress, and snaps the heavy steel cuffs shut. She collapses to her knees on the stone patio, sobbing uncontrollably, her tears ruining her flawless makeup. I look past the arresting officers and watch the crowd of wealthy, superficial guests. They are not rushing to help their friends. They are not offering to call defense attorneys or post bail. Instead, nearly every single person in the yard has pulled out their smartphone. They have the cameras pointed directly at Justin and Megan. The people my son and his wife desperately tried to impress are now eagerly recording their humiliating downfall. They are zooming in on the handcuffs and the tears, making sure they capture every pathetic moment to post on their own social media accounts later. The influencers are turning my son into a viral spectacle of total disgrace. Vincent walks over to where I am standing near the coolers. He buttons his suit jacket and watches the officers drag Justin and Megan off the patio. He tells me that the bank has already changed the locks on the front door and the federal transport van is waiting in the driveway. He nods his head once, acknowledging that the execution of the plan was absolutely flawless. I watch the police march my son across the grass. He looks over his shoulder, trying to catch my eye one last time, but I simply turn my back to him. I grab my keys from my pocket and walk toward the side gate, leaving the ruined luau and the shattered remnants of his life completely behind me. The red and blue police lights wash over the imported stone patio one last time before fading down the suburban street. The silence left behind is absolute and heavy. The wealthy guests who had been drinking champagne just an hour ago are now rushing toward the side gate. They do not look at me. They do not offer to help the catering staff clean up the broken glass or the spilled food. They just want to escape the gravitational pull of my son and his ruined life. I stand completely still near the white canopy and watch the taillights of their expensive cars disappear into the dusk. I place my hand flat against my chest, expecting to feel the heavy, crushing ache of a father who has just lost his only child. But there is nothing. The space where that blind, unconditional love used to be is completely empty. There is no sadness in my heart. There is only the deep, profound relief of a man who has finally amputated a severely diseased limb before the infection could spread and kill the rest of the body. I turn my back on the massive empty house and walk to my truck. I do not look over my shoulder even once. The next 6 months move with the relentless efficiency of a perfectly designed machine. Vincent, the corporate litigator, completely dismantles any attempt my son makes to build a defense. Justin and Megan try to hire a high-profile legal team, but the bank has already frozen all their stolen assets. They are forced to rely on public defenders who take one look at the forged loan documents, the medical affidavit, and the crystal-clear audio recordings before advising them to beg for a plea deal. But the federal prosecutor refuses to offer any leniency whatsoever. The trial is swift and absolutely merciless. I sit in the front row of the courtroom every single day. I listen as the state plays the audio of them, complaining about the boy crying in the basement. I watch as the jury looks at the high-definition photographs of the automated pet feeder and the heavy commercial deadbolt. The alliance between my son and his wife shatters completely on the witness stand. They spend the entire trial blaming each other, screaming across the courtroom in a desperate attempt to save their own skin. When the judge hands down the final sentence, the courtroom is dead silent. Justin and Megan are both sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. They are led out of the courtroom in heavy steel shackles. Justin looks back at me from the doorway. His tropical tan is completely gone, replaced by the pale, sickly pallor of a man who realizes his life is entirely over. I do not blink. I do not offer him a single nod of comfort. I simply watch the heavy wooden doors close behind him, sealing his fate forever. With the criminal convictions secured, the financial dominoes finally fall exactly as I planned. The federal bank officially nullifies the forged home equity line of credit, clearing my name of the massive fraudulent debt. The bank seizes the sprawling suburban fortress and auctions it off to the highest bidder to recoup their losses. Everything inside the house, from the imported orchids to the designer furniture, is liquidated to pay the massive restitution fines. The entire manufactured empire is wiped completely off the map. It is as if they never existed at all. While the legal system buries my son, I focus the entirety of my energy on the only thing that actually matters. I use my own clean, hard-earned savings to hire the best family law attorney in the state. Because I hold the original medical affidavit and the direct endorsement of the federal investigators, the state child welfare system fast-tracks my petition. The process is rigorous but undeniable. 6 months after I carried him out of that dark concrete box, I stand in front of a family court judge and formally legally adopt Leo. The judge signs the final decree and hands the paperwork down to me. I look at the paper and realize that for the first time in a very long time, I actually have a real son. Leo does not sleep in a windowless room anymore. I spent the last few months transforming the largest room in my quiet cabin into a space built entirely for him. We painted the walls a bright, cheerful yellow. I installed 2 massive windows that let the morning sun pour across the hardwood floor, providing a perfect view of the tall, green pine trees outside. He has a thick, soft mattress covered in warm quilts. I built him a set of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and filled them with every adventure story and fairy tale I could find. He does not eat from a timed machine. He sits at my wooden kitchen table every morning and we eat hot scrambled eggs and toast together. The healing process is slow, but it is incredibly beautiful to witness. The night terrors that plagued him during the first few weeks slowly fade away. The boy who was too terrified to make a single sound now laughs out loud when we watch cartoons in the living room. The child who flinched at sudden movements now runs across the yard to catch lightning bugs in the evening air. He is gaining weight steadily. His cheeks are full and pink. The dark hollow shadows have completely vanished from his eyes, replaced by a bright, curious light. He knows he is safe. He knows that the heavy doors are gone forever, and he knows that he finally has a father who actually loves him unconditionally. It is a quiet Tuesday evening, just as the sun begins to set over the woods behind the cabin. The air is crisp and cool. The warm smell of fresh sawdust and pine fills my small workshop. I am standing at my heavy wooden workbench, holding a piece of sandpaper. Leo is standing right next to me, balancing on a sturdy wooden stool so he can reach the tabletop. He is wearing a tiny pair of denim overalls and holding a small hammer in his hands. We are building a wooden birdhouse together. It is a simple design, but to Leo, it is the most important project in the entire world. I hold the small wooden panels steady while he carefully taps the metal nails into the wood. His tongue sticks out of the corner of his mouth in deep concentration. He hits the nail perfectly flush with the wood and looks up at me with a massive, proud smile. I smile back at him and ruffle his hair, telling him he is going to be a master builder one day. He leans against my side, resting his small head against my arm as we admire our work. I wrap my arm around his shoulders, holding him close. I look down at the small wooden house we just constructed, and a profound sense of peace finally washes over my soul. The chaos, the betrayal, and the darkness of the past year are completely gone. I realize in this quiet, perfect moment that true family is never defined by blood. Blood only gives you a biological connection, but it does not guarantee loyalty or respect or love. True family is a deliberate choice. It is something you construct carefully and intentionally. It is built nail by nail, day by day, on a solid, unbreakable foundation of absolute truth. The most profound lesson this story offers is that true family is never defined by biological ties, but by the choices we make to protect, respect, and love one another. Blood may connect us, but it does not excuse cruelty, greed, or the exploitation of the vulnerable. Warren's journey teaches us that holding on to toxic relationships simply out of a sense of familial obligation only enables abuse. Sometimes the ultimate act of justice requires us to tear down the very foundations we helped build to save those who cannot save themselves. Authenticity and compassion must always outweigh superficial appearances. Share your thoughts on Warren's difficult choice in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about uncovering the truth and standing up for what is right.